Scheduled for just over 2 hours' time. At the centre of it all, an American company hoping to become the first private business to achieve a soft landing there. If it succeeds, it would be the first American vehicle to do so since 1972. NASA was involved then with its famous Apollo moonwalkers, and again today. It's invested $118 million into the venture. But what's it all about? What does the craft hope to find there? And how are private companies reshaping the space race? Big questions throughout the show. We'll have our expert panelists and guests to bring you the answers. But first, let's start with our US correspondent, James Matthews, who's at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington. And I mean, James, this is really very exciting. We were expecting it to happen in about half an hour's time, but it's actually been delayed.
That's right, Yalda. Yeah, they've chosen to exercise an extra orbit. There will be sound scientific reasons for doing so. There are certainly sound historical reasons for doing so because of the failure behind this sort of operation in the past. Only around 50% of lunar landing attempts have been successful. But as you say, I'm at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. It is here where the United States puts on display its pride at its history of space exploration. If you take a look to my left, you can see the command module of Apollo 11, occupied once upon a time by Neil Armstrong in 1969. He became, of course, the first man to set foot on the moon. That was a crude, the last time the United States duplicated that feat was in 1972 with Apollo 17. That was a crewed mission with NASA astronauts on board. The US is the only country ever to have sent humans to the surface of the moon. The others have conducted soft landings, so-called soft landings. China, India, the former Soviet Union, and then last month Japan joined that club with unmanned spacecraft. The Odysseus, which is heading towards the South Pole region of the moon, it should land, if all goes according to plan, at around 4 miles an hour in several hours' time. Of course, it will be the first soft landing on the moon by a commercially made and operated vehicle, the first under NASA's Artemis lunar program, a program designed to establish a permanent base on the moon to facilitate human missions to Mars. It is, as I say, privately funded. One small step for man, one giant leap for private enterprise. And I mean, we see private enterprise all around here, people intrigued and engaged in the space race. And of course, this is partly to do with the space race, the current space race with China. On board the Odysseus, when it goes to the far side of the moon, some 250,000 miles from Earth, are a dozen payloads, essentially experiments, instruments, far more technical, far beyond the kind of thing that we have sent to the moon in the past. It will be looking at lunar dust, the effects of lunar dust, which should make things easier for man to go to the moon in future. There will also be astronomical research instruments on board. Let's just take a look at Neil Armstrong's spacesuit before we leave you. That is space exploration 1969 style. The plan with this most recent venture with the Odysseus spacecraft is to make this kind of exploration far easier, to learn far more about the planet that is our nearest neighbour. But as I say, Yalda, it's been delayed because flight controllers in Houston have chosen to exercise an extra orbit. Ultimately, caution is the watchword given the failure of similar expeditions and operations in the past.
Indeed, as you say, James, so much risk involved. Thanks so much for that update. Really exciting to see all of the things there at the museum. With me now is our science correspondent, Thomas Moore, and the space journalist, Kate Arkless-Gray, and author and astronomer, Dr. David Whitehouse. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Thomas, I'll come to you first. I mean, it is exciting. The excitement is building. But of course, as James was saying, caution is the key word here, because when we think about what they're trying to achieve here.
Yeah, I mean, about half of all moon missions have ended in failure, and even the ones that are probably counted as a success, the Japanese mission just quite recently, it did land on its head. It's difficult landing on the moon because these spacecraft are generally doing it on their own. It takes too long for signals to get from the moon back to a controller on Earth and then back to the moon. So by the time they've spotted a hazard, it would be too late. So this spacecraft is packed with some really clever technology to help it descend safely, because that's going to be what's needed when humans go back. But let's take a closer look at Odysseus. It is about the size of a phone box, and it's testing navigational aids and other equipment that should make landing on the moon much easier in future. It's due to touch down near the Malapert A crater, which is 200 miles from the unexplored South Pole. And the terrain there is really rugged. It's hazardous for a spacecraft that's landing on its own. So why take the risk? Well, the pole has craters that are permanently in shadow, where the temperature is as low as minus 230 degrees. And they are thought to contain billions of litres of frozen water. And that will be crucial for long-duration human missions.
Kate, I'll bring you in. I mean, just to pick up on what both James and Thomas have said. I mean, when we sort of think about what they're trying to do, hurtling at the distance and the speed that they're trying to do, and then the precision in which they need to land, it's quite extraordinary for all of these things to come together.
Absolutely. I mean, they've done very well to get their mission off the ground and as far as they have done, but now we're entering this really tricky phase where we're going to see, are they successful? Can they soft land on the moon? And as you were just saying, there are so many of these missions that have, reached this kind of point, and then just at the last few moments, something's gone wrong. They've hit the lunar surface at great speed and ended up, in smithereens, as even the latest Russian attempt to land on the moon. I think their press release said that the spacecraft ceased to exist after a collision with the lunar surface.
David, there's a sort of a series of firsts here, the sort of number of things that's happening for the first time.
First landing in the moon by an American spacecraft since Apollo 17 in 1972, and that was a crewed mission. The first private mission to go there, because the private companies involved in space exploration in America has been the story of the last 20 years, with Elon Musk leading the way. NASA in the past would have built this thing itself, spent a lot of money, and actually when it started out on this project, he wouldn't have known how much money it would have cost, whereas now he goes to a private company and says, how much is it? They give them a cost, they tell them how much it is, and that's what NASA pays. So they get a service from a private company, they know how much it's going to cost, and if it doesn't work, they get a refund. So everybody's got their fingers crossed.
And I guess that's the point, right? It's private companies taking over, therefore it's more entrepreneurial and risk is factored in.
It's innovation. I spoke to the founder of the company, Intuitive Machines, and he was saying that they've really had to go back to basics. If they do it the way that everybody else has done it before, they will fail. They will never be able to do it for that price, because NASA is getting a bargain. So they have gone back and they've looked at 3D printing of the engines. They've completely redesigned valves that are used in the system to supply all the fuel and so on. They've completely rethought how this should be done, and that's why this is going to work, hopefully.
And talk us through the idea of the South Pole, because this is where it's crucial. This is why it's slightly different to what the others have done.
So there's a lot of interest in the South Pole. That's the place where we think it's most likely that you would find water ice. And why do we care about that? Well, if we're looking to send humans to the moon and actually keep them there, create a habitat, or even use the moon as a stepping stone to go further into the solar system, then you need to have water for them to drink, oxygen for them to breathe, and also rocket fuel. And if you can get at that water ice, break it down into its constituent parts, you can use the hydrogen as rocket fuel, and that saves you so much in the way of the amount of fuel you'd actually need to take with you to the moon. If you can then sort of use the moon to refuel your craft, then you could probably go further on to Mars. So that's the thinking there. And there's, China also has some missions coming up that are looking quite interesting and exciting and may even beat NASA to the South Pole.
Yeah, David, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that this is a new space race now.
It is, yes. You can discount Russia. Russia was the first space superpower in, and it's the first space superpower out. Now it's America and China. And by the previous timetable, the Artemis program to put people back on the moon, they were talking about a fly around the moon with a crew later this year, with a landing next year or possibly the year after. But that's slipping now. It's all moving to the right. And that's because Elon Musk's lander and his big spaceship that he wants to, the Starship, to put this thing into space, and he's designing the lander to go on the moon, that's well behind schedule. And that's going to take a lot of testing and a lot of flights. And China has recently come up with its own plan for the exploration of the solar system. And it's put in some interesting lines in there over the next few years. And it's thought that they may attempt a manned landing on the moon 2028, 2030. Now, if you think it's 2024 and the Americans are thinking of 2026, 2027 for the first landing on the moon, then you're getting very close between the two. It only takes China to give more impetus to this and for Elon Musk's Starship to need an extra year or two of development, because that's a very complicated system. You're getting many launches, fueling in space, many landings on the moon before you trust it to keep people alive. You really have got competition between America and China at the moment.
Yeah, exactly that, the sort of new space race. Let's bring in a former NASA astronaut, Dr. Nicholas Patrick, who joins us live now. And Nicholas, I mean, you know better than anyone, I mean, the excitement around this, you although this is a private robot spacecraft, but you understand all too well.
Your audio cut out there, but yes, I'm very excited to see this spacecraft land on the moon. It's a crucial stepping stone in the path to getting humans back to the moon in the middle of this decade. So I've got my fingers crossed that it goes smoothly, and I think that the science that we learn from this mission will be crucial to putting humans safely back on the moon, especially at this important location, which is near the South Pole.
Yeah, we've been talking about sort of the significance of this. I mean, it isn't just the idea of a moon landing. Just talk us through the significance of what's being attempted here.
Well, there have only been, as you know, about 50 attempted landings on the moon. Only about 20 odd of those have been successful. So it's by no means an assured outcome today. So just demonstrating a successful landing will be quite an achievement. They're also carrying a number of science experiments that will help safely bring humans back to the moon, among them things like navigation experiments. As you know, there's no GPS on the moon, which is our default method of navigation down here on Earth. So you need to use other methods, like perhaps using a laser to image the surface of the moon, which you can do reliably because there are no clouds, and then comparing that to an onboard map of the moon so that you know exactly where you are and how high you are. They're also going to be looking at the way the lunar regolith, the loose soil on the surface of the moon, is disturbed by the rocket plume. That can be quite significant. It poses loose regolith thrown up by rocket exhaust, poses a threat to nearby landers and habitats and so on. So understanding that interaction is crucial. So there's a lot we can learn here and a lot to look forward to.
Yeah, and we were just saying we're expecting it to happen in our hour of the show. It's been delayed, and I guess we don't really know why. That's rocket science, literally.
Well, I can tell you, as somebody who's run launches of human spacecraft, nothing ever quite happens on time. There are always issues that need to be ironed flat, and they're clearly doing a good job of staying close to schedule.
Yeah, I guess, well, the other thing to really, and we've discussed it here on the panel, is how risky all of this is. So many things need to come together.
Well, obviously on this mission, there's no risk to human life, which is good. It makes it easier to experiment and try more daring things. But there will always be risk in spaceflight. That's something that astronauts accept when they take the job. And really, the trade-off here is between cost and schedule on the one hand and risk and the potential for great achievement on the other. If we are in a space race with the Chinese now, as many think we are, then it may come down to who's prepared to take the greatest risk. And while I don't want to see anybody take unnecessary risks, we can't just stay at home and let it all happen.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nicholas Patrick, for joining us here on the programme. I'm just going to bring in our panellists again. And Thomas, Yeah, I want to kind of understand a little bit more about the company that's doing this, because Jeff Koons, the artist, for example, is sending stuff to the moon. Are they sort of like a postal service now as well? You can pay them a bit of money, they'll take your items to the moon?
That's commercial reality. I think that's what we're going to see increasingly, that NASA pays the core cost of getting there, but not enough to actually fund the mission. So these private companies will have to go looking elsewhere, and that does include Jeff Koons doing a sculpture. There's an outdoor clothing manufacturer. That's the I think it's called Lunar Phases or Moon Phases or something like that. There's a clothing manufacturer that's testing out a new thermal insulation and that kind of stuff. So they do need to look elsewhere for extra cash. The last mission, Astrobotic, that tried in January to get to the moon but ultimately failed, they actually were carrying human ashes, which caused an awful lot of controversy with Indigenous Americans, because they consider the moon to be a sacred place, not somewhere that you put human remains.
And just to continue on that theme, the idea of private companies doing this, being the Amazon or Postal Service, is there sort of a debate also taking place about sort of private companies having a monopoly over this, or governments being more dependent on them as a result?
Well, I think it's something that NASA has really been quite forward-thinking on, the way that they've invited commercial companies to deliver services that they themselves have managed in the past, but they could then spend their money differently. So instead of rebuilding a space shuttle so they could take astronauts to the space station, they opened up the commercial crew program. So you've got now SpaceX is delivering astronauts to the space station. So instead of taking on the entire risk of a mission to the moon to deliver some payloads, they're actually taking on more risk than they would normally do. Because if NASA runs a mission, it has to work, because they won't get the funding from the government if they fail. But with these, taking a punt on various different companies, they're able to accept a higher range of risk. And they even said maybe only half of these might succeed, and they would still consider that a success.
We are at the stage whereby companies are not going to need NASA or government agencies, because SpaceX, it relied on government contracts, on money from NASA to develop its rocket. And it couldn't have done so without government help. But it's at the stage whereby it can do things on its own now. And
is that right? Is that really the case?
For instance, take the International Space Station, which is the huge, biggest thing ever put into space. That's reaching the end of its life. And what's going to replace it is not going to be a government facility. It's going to be facilities run by smaller companies, perhaps by SpaceX, certainly by Boeing and certain other companies. It's not going to be an American space station first. It's going to be a Boeing space station or a company space station. And that's the ecology we're moving into.
Just briefly, what are the risks involved in that?
Well, as Patrick said, every time you go into space with people, there is a risk involved. And I think sometimes in the media, we tend to think it's safer than it is. Anybody who stands next to a rocket, or particularly gets into a capsule, they are under no illusion that this is still dangerous.
Well,
I was just going to say, if companies can land on the moon now, not just countries, I think it does open up the questions of ownership and who should set the laws. And I think that is going to be a challenge in the years to come.
Yeah, very much so. Really fascinating hearing all your thoughts, and hopefully we'll be able to see it all take place in about an hour and a half's time. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, the incident that snowballed into a diplomatic row. I'll be joined by the father of Ilara Salis, a 39-year-old anti-fascist who was detained in Hungary and now accused of being part of an extremist left-wing organisation. Allegations she denies. Stay with us for that. Next tonight, the diplomatic row over an Italian woman being held by Hungarian authorities. The story of Ilaria Sales has shocked many. The 39-year-old teacher is accused of attacking neo-Nazis during a protest in Budapest in February last year. Ms. Sales appeared in court in shackles. Italy ended up summoning Hungary's ambassador after the images emerged. Ms. Sales denies the charges brought against her, which includes attempted assault and being affiliated with an extreme left-wing organisation, charges which carry a prison sentence of up to 11 years. Well, joining me now is Roberto Sales, Ilaria's father. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us here on the programme. You actually saw your daughter yesterday. She's been in prison now for almost a year. Just tell me how she is.
Well, she's fine now. Of course, is tired because is having only 1 hour of open air per day. But she's fine, and my daughter is very strong. Is dealing very well with the situation.
As I said, she's been there for almost a year. She could end up being in prison for 11 years. Just tell me where the case is at now, because, of course, we also just showed our viewers those images of her appearing in shackles.
Yes, actually, at the moment, we had the first trial of the process was the 29th of January when Ilaria was brought to the court in chain. And we have another trial on the 28th of March. And hopefully we will speed up the process. However, we expect to bring her to house arrest as soon as possible using the European laws that are available, even if are not very much used for whatever reasons.
Roberto, I was reading about the conditions in the prison and where Ilaria is staying. Some of it just sounds absolutely horrific.
Absolutely. I think for the first 35 days, she was basically in a condition that I define as torture. So 8 days without paper toilet, without sanitary pads and soap. I don't think that in any nation in the world, and more than that, in a nation in a European community are acceptable for a human being.
The Hungarian government has responded to criticism over those images that we saw in the courtroom. They say, sure, she was restrained in the courtroom, and yes, she had already spent 11 months detained, but inhumane, not really, no. Taken seriously due to the severity of the crime she's charged with, more likely, and that's why they're saying that they are treating her the way she is. Are you also concerned, because there is some speculation that this has turned into something that's a little bit more political and not just about the case of your daughter, between Italy and Hungary?
Well, I think this is very dangerous for Ilaria, because if it's turning political, it's a disaster. So we are talking about human rights. If my daughter is guilty for what is accused, is correct that she's getting a sentence for that. But nobody can treat a human being like she was treated, particularly at the beginning of this story.
As we said, she denies these charges. What are you hoping will happen now?
I hope that as soon as possible we can manage to obtain the house arrest. We've been told that the first step has to be in Hungary, even if it's very difficult, for instance, to find an apartment there to rent. But we hope this will be done shortly, and then the second step is have her in Italy for the house arrest, and then we will carry on with the process. Ilaria keeps saying that she's innocent, so we will fight to demonstrate her innocence.
OK, Roberto, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you very much.
Coming up next on The World with me, Yalda Hakim, ahead of the 2-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'll have the very latest on the situation on the ground. We'll also be speaking to our correspondent, Deborah Haynes. Stay with us. Welcome back. In a moment, we're going to turn our attention to Ukraine. First, though, I want to bring you some pictures released by the White House shortly before we came on air. They're of Joe Biden, the widow of Alexei Navalny, Yulia, and their daughter, Dasha. Posting on X, the president said he met with them to express his condolences for their devastating loss. Joe Biden went on to say Alexei's legacy of courage will live on in Yulia and Dasha and the countless people across Russia fighting for democracy and human rights. You remember Alexei was a fierce opponent of the war in Ukraine. And that's where we're going to turn next. It's almost 2 years since Russia's invasion, and peace couldn't be further away. Now, alarm bells are ringing about the threat of Russia to the rest of Europe. It begs the question, if war spreads beyond Ukrainian borders, will NATO countries be prepared? In a moment, we'll have a special report from our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who is in Estonia for us tonight. But first, I want to focus on the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Our international correspondent, John Sparks, joins us from Kharkiv. And John, you know, this story dominated headlines for so long. It's now moved away from the headlines. It's turned into a war of attrition. But of course, it's felt there on the ground. Just tell us where you are and what you're seeing.
Yeah, hi, yeah, very good question. You might be wondering why I'm wearing a coat and scarf inside in a hotel conference room. We are in Kharkiv in northeastern Ukraine. We were setting up for the interview outside in the parking lot, and the hotel staff came out and saying, no, you can't do that. Drone strikes. They're worried about drone strikes from the Russians here. There have been a whole lot of attacks in this city. We did as we were asked, and we've set up in the conference room, done it very quickly. We have had a chance over the last couple of days to go to the eastern front, about 120 kilometers here. We've been to part of the front in and around the city of Kupiansk, and we've had a chance to speak to commanders and battalion leaders and soldiers on the ground, and what they've had to say is really interesting. They're under a whole lot of pressure from the Russian military, something that's been acknowledged by President Zelensky himself. He's accused the Russians of massing tens of thousands of troops in this particular area. And the soldiers, they told us that whereas once, a few months ago, they would be fending off 1 or 2 attacks per day from the Russians, now it's almost continuous attacks every single day. They said the ammunition shortages are absolutely crippling, about 1 to 10. So for every 1 Ukrainian shell they fire, the Russians fire about 10 back. And they said they have to be really careful about what they do, what they fire at the Russians, because they just don't have the equipment and they don't have the ammunition. But that said, I thought morale was still pretty strong. The soldiers out there at the front, they're tired, but they're strong. As several said to me, what option do we have? What choice do we have? Do we let the Russians in?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, John, you know, what's become clear over the last couple of years is what Ukraine is desperate for is weapons, money, and of course there's a big conversation around mobilization. But if we go back to February 24th, 2022, you were actually in Kharkiv. Just talk us through what it was like at the time.
You know, it was a pretty extraordinary thing. We were staying in this rather smart hotel in the center of the city called the Palace Hotel, which incidentally has been bombed. It's closed now. You can't stay there. But we were out the evening before, and it was pretty calm. People were drinking hot chocolate. They were skating at the outdoor skating rink in the center of town, and we didn't speak to a single person who thought that Russia, who thought that Putin would attack Ukraine. They just didn't think that it would happen. And the following morning, the cluster bombs, the artillery strikes, the missile strikes which hit Kharkiv's northern suburbs, they came as a terrible shock to people. And I remember speaking to Mark Austin at the time. I too was struggling to come to terms with this new reality, as I think this clip will show. Could have been rockets, felt very close to the center of, there's one. I don't know if you can hear that. Can you hear that, Mark?
Yeah.
It feels very close to the center of the city. We are taking a position by the wall on the roof of our hotel.
I mean, it's quite an extraordinary moment. I mean, John, I got there a few days later, and it really, even though the intelligence was there, it did feel quite shocking that it happened. Yeah,
I didn't expect it personally. I didn't think Putin would go through with it, although, you know, there had been a lot of talk about it in the days preceding the event. I wonder whether he concentrated much of his force on Kharkiv, because this is actually a Russian-speaking city. The majority of people here actually speak Russian. There are Russian schools and colleges here as well. He may have thought that he would be welcomed here, but he wasn't. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that's happened over the last couple of years. I mean, if there was a debate about Ukrainian identity, there isn't now, even in places like Kharkiv. And I think that is the biggest obstacle that Vladimir Putin has. You know, people in this country don't want him, and that's a big deal.
Yeah. Very much so. John, thanks so much for all of your analysis there. Now, with growing concern about Russia's next move, neighbouring Estonia isn't taking any chances. Ordinary people are now signing up for training drills to get ready for the possibility of a wider conflict. Estonia is one of 6 NATO countries that share a land border with Russia and has warned of a possible attack within the next decade. Much of the country's border crosses a lake, but the city of Narva up the northeast is only separated by a river and seen as a point of vulnerability. Ordinary people are now joining volunteer Defence Force training on the island of Hiiumaa off Estonia's west coast. From there, our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes sent us this report.
These are no ordinary soldiers. Their commander calls them the SAS. It stands for Saturdays and Sundays, because that's when Estonia's citizen army trains. An example of national service that some say countries like the UK ought to follow as the threat from Russia grows. The commander has a warning for Moscow if it tries to invade Estonia after Ukraine.
It will be bloody mess if you come here. We will definitely kill as many of you as possible.
And what's your message to other NATO countries that maybe aren't doing as much to mobilise
Wake
their...
up. It won't stop in Ukraine. If we don't stop them there, they will come further and further.
These volunteers on Hiiumaa Island off Estonia's western coast didn't need any wake-up call. Anneli switches shopkeeping for shooting when it's her weekend to train.
We are preparing to be good soldiers.
A group of 15 mainly middle-aged dads joined this unit of the Defence League last year, in part because of the war in Ukraine. Taavi says he doesn't want conflict, but he's ready for combat if Russia attacks.
I have to take the weapon and trying to protect my family, my home.
And why is your island so important to you?
It's my home. It's easy. You need home, yeah. It's a good place.
This island of some 9,000 people would be an attractive target for Vladimir Putin in any war with NATO, giving him the ability to control access to the Baltic Sea.
The governmental sector understands.
The head of the Defence League says European security is fundamentally linked to what happens in Ukraine. Should Russia succeed there, the chance of an attack on a NATO state grows.
How seriously we take the support in Ukraine. If we give up in Ukraine, so are we giving up also our own defense? So it's quite critical and should be not separated.
It's a question that matters in particular for this place in northeast Estonia. The city of Narva sits on one side of the river, with Russia's Ivangorod on the other. A crossing point, called the Friendship Bridge, still connects the two foes.
It's hard to believe that this is the very edge of NATO's border and Russia is just a few metres behind me. But any attempt by Russian forces to cross that line would trigger an Allied response.
The bridge is only open to pedestrians for now because of construction work on the Russian side.
This is so-called Dragon Teeth.
The officer says the area is calm but tense, 2 years on from Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Nobody feels comfortable when you're hearing that war is started. Nobody feels it, but not scared, for sure. But you open your eyes more wide.
Yet not everyone who lives in Narva would agree. A majority of its residents speak Russian, and some are sympathetic to Moscow. Yuri is loyal to Estonia, but says he could never regard Russia as an enemy.
There are problems between the governments, not the people. We regularly go to Russia to visit our friends and family.
But if large-scale conflict does return to Europe, everyone will need to pick a side and be ready to fight for it.
And Deborah joins us now. And Deborah, you're currently in southern Lithuania, but at the weekend, you and I were both at the Munich Security Conference, and it was really very clear that Europe, NATO, is extremely worried about this conflict potentially spilling over.
Yes, and you had Volodymyr Zelensky there as well, didn't you? Making that appeal once more to the West to give him more weapons. He received that hero's welcome, but he doesn't need strong words. He needs strong physical support in the form of weapons and ammunition. And as John was saying, those soldiers on the front line in Ukraine are outgunned. They've been outgunned all along. But at the beginning, they had this ferocious response when they managed to defy the odds and push Russian forces back. Then last year, that floundering counteroffensive, which really dented morale. And now moving into the third year of this war, it really is about the arms race. Who can rearm fast enough? And at the moment, Russia's really winning that.
Yeah, and Deborah, there are big questions about the leadership of NATO, and you know, Mark Rutte's name, the Dutch PM, that's been thrown around at the moment.
Yes, and it's a really key moment, isn't it? You've had Jens Stoltenberg, who's the long-standing Secretary-General of NATO, the former Norwegian Prime Minister. His term has actually been extended multiple times because the Allies couldn't agree on a replacement. There was that weird situation last year when the former Defence Secretary, British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, made clear he really wanted the job. He had lots of backers, but not the US. And the US really is the kingmaker when it comes to this very secretive process of choosing the next Secretary-General. The US is going to be hosting the NATO summit this year, which marks 75 years of the alliance. And so today you had the UK and the US both coming out publicly and saying that they strongly support the current Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte to take over that role. I actually spoke to Mr. Rutte at the Munich Security Conference and asked him if he wanted the job, and he said that previously in a television interview he'd made the mistake of sort of suggesting that he actually might quite like it, and he realised that he shouldn't be really talking at all about it, and so stayed diplomatically quiet. But it's crucial who is going to take over that role at this key time when the Allies are really under pressure, not just to ramp up their support for Ukraine, but also to ramp up their ability to defend themselves and deter threats and deal with the consequences of whatever happens from this year's US elections, with everybody thinking about what will it mean for the alliance if once again Donald Trump wins.
Yeah, indeed, which was where I was going to take this, because, of course, that significant NATO conference summit is going to be hosted, as you say, by the United States, I believe, in July. But in November, there is going to be another crucial moment with the elections in the United States. And we have been hearing over and over again from Donald Trump, him questioning the alliance, him questioning NATO and the future of it and the future of the United States within it.
Yes, and it's, you could almost feel the collective groan amongst European allies, and obviously you've got Canada too, when Donald Trump made that very predictable outburst on the campaign train a couple of weeks ago, when he sort of talked about how any NATO country that isn't meeting the minimum 2% that they all should, frankly, by now be paying of their GDP on defences, then why should the US go and support them if they were ever attacked? And he even seemed to sort of suggest that he would encourage any enemy to go and attack a NATO country that isn't spending its dues. Now, this obviously triggered huge outrage because Article 5, that fundamental founding principle that an attack on one ally is an attack on all and would meet a collective response, shouldn't be undermined by a NATO member state. But there are also an acknowledgement that actually the allies really need to take their defences seriously, and it is pretty shocking that here we are 2 years on from the start of a full-scale war by Russia inside Europe against Ukraine, which isn't a NATO state, but it wants to be. And still there are many NATO allies that aren't even meeting that minimal threshold of spending on their armed forces.
Indeed. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us and for all of your reporting. Deborah Haynes there from southern Lithuania. Now, I just want to show you these latest pictures that have come through from Valencia. Emergency services are tackling a large fire which has broken out in a high-rise residential building. Local reports say several people have been injured. Posting on X, Spain's Prime Minister said he was dismayed by the terrible fire in a building in Valencia. I want to convey my solidarity to all the people affected and in recognition to all the emergency personnel already deployed at the scene. And there were also some really quite extraordinary images of more than 20 fire crews attempting to contain the blaze. You can see it there after that 14-storey residential block in the Spanish city of Valencia was engulfed. You can see the dramatic images of the fire and how it spread to the adjoining building. We're being told several people are being treated for burns and smoke inhalation, including members of the emergency response teams. We're also told that 2 people were rescued from the burning tower block. So dramatic scenes there in Valencia, in the Spanish city of Valencia. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. After the break, more on our top story. It's had a 620,000-mile journey, and if successful, will be the first private spacecraft to land on the moon intact. Stay with us for that.
In short, it's to raise money for charity. That was the bottom line of all of this. It's my 4th backwards challenge. They've gradually got bigger and bigger and higher. So I think this now is probably going to be the highest point I'll go to on the planet. But yeah, I lost my granddad to a heart attack a few years ago. And it was not just that, but also the stats and the numbers that come along with this that just blew my mind. So along with doing something for the world's first, so no one's ever been up and down Kilimanjaro backwards, and to raise some money for the British Heart Foundation, it seemed like a real sort of no-brainer. As you can see from some of this content, it's still a bit of a blur for me. I only got back a little under a week ago, so some of these videos that I sent over, it's pretty amazing to look back on. It's not easy doing either, if I'm honest. So going up to the summit, of course, you've got all the altitude involved. There's some really arduous tracks. You've got some pretty uneven pathways. But coming down, as you saw in that last clip there, it's pretty steep and it's loose shingle. So there's lots of slips, lots of falls. We use that short rope technique as well, just to keep me a little bit safer. I'd have probably said if you made me choose, coming down was a little bit harder than going up, which is maybe why the other 2 guys didn't do it in the first place. But yeah, amazing challenge. And it also made me the first European ever to make it to the summit. So these other 2 guys from all over the world made it up to the summit, but no one from Europe before. It's a funny old thing. I'm a personal trainer, so the training thing was quite easy. And really the idea of training to do something quite specific, you just do that thing that's specific. So the more you work on that, the easier it becomes. If you want to get good at riding a bike, ride a bike more. It's kind of that simple. Unfortunately, as you said there, we don't have much altitude here in the UK. We don't really have anywhere to practice higher. And also, I would say it was the sort of intangibles that I found really challenging. The porters and the food was also amazing out there. However, you kind of get a little bit sick of spaghetti by the end of the day. You're sleeping and sharing tents, so things like smells, things like packing your bag at the end of the day and unloading it at the start of the day. You didn't really prepare for it. I know physically not that challenging, just adds to a little bit more of the challenge, which I really, really didn't expect before heading out there.
Welcome back. Let's get more now on the American spacecraft expected to land on the moon in the next couple of hours. It's the first US attempt at a moon landing in more than half a century. Well, joining me now on my panel, space journalist, Kate Archelaus-Gray, and the author and astronomer, Dr. David Whitehouse. Thank you both for joining us again. This is very exciting. It has been delayed already twice, and it's expected to happen around 11:24.
Yes. So I guess everybody will be very tense in that control room at the moment, waiting for the moment of truth to see if they can actually pull off the landing.
Because, of course, these things are very risky, aren't they? Do we know why the delay?
They'll have been very, very cautious. They're putting it in extra orbit. And the rumour is that, when it enters lunar orbit, it goes into its descent orbit, which is designed to bring it above the landing site at the South Pole. And it's got to go from 4,000 miles an hour, roughly just over a mile a second, down to almost zero to drop down the last 25 kilometres. And that means that in the final orbit, particularly the final half orbit, there's a lot of resetting of the computers done. There's a lot of making sure that they poll the computer to make sure that what it's seeing is what it's in its memory. So it has a memory of what it's going to encounter, because it's all on its own, in the sense because it's 2 seconds away from Earth in terms of communication. So it has to be on its own. So its internal guidance system resets itself at the beginning.
There can't be any kind of remote control?
No, it's entirely on its own. Although they do have the last interaction with it about an hour before the landing, where they make sure everything's working. And evidently, when that happened for the first time, they weren't exactly quite sure, and they went for an extra orbit.
Got 20 seconds. It's on its own, but it's in good health.
That's what we're hearing so far, and it's got this special technology on it to help it find out where exactly it is and how fast it's going, and that's how they will hopefully stick the landing.
Kate, David, thank you both for joining us here on the programme. Well, that's all for tonight's programme. Be sure to stay with Sky News for that very special moon landing, scheduled for, as we were saying, 11:24 p.m. So do stay with us because you will see that here live, if it happens, on Sky News. News at 10 is next, and we're back on Monday. Good night.